Ladies and gentlemen, I am Hannes Schliemann, Director of WT Advisors. I am a trade lawyer and the co-lead of a project supporting the EU delegation to Singapore on the implementation of the EU-Singapore FTA. I have the pleasure and privilege of moderating today's webinar. Today's event is organized by the EU delegation to Singapore as part of a policy support facility project on the implementation of the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, or EU-SFTA, our hashtag today. And it is co-sponsored by EuroCham Singapore. Allow me therefore to welcome you all again on behalf of the European Union delegation and the co-sponsor very warmly to today's webinar on trade in pharmaceuticals and medical devices between the EU and Singapore, and via Singapore and the EU. Pharmaceuticals and medical devices play a very significant role in both Singapore's and the EU's manufacturing and trade profiles. But most importantly, they play a crucial role for public health, of course. We will have time to look at all these aspects here today. This is the latest in a series of outreach webinars on the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, which has now been in force for over 2 years, so cause for celebration. A few housekeeping reminders for everyone before we begin. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the EU delegation's website and its YouTube channel. Those who registered for the webinar will receive an email with the respective links to the recording and the presentations. We would like to encourage you to share your questions during the webinar and take this opportunity to actively interact with our experts. For this, please use the Q&A in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. So the Q&A tab rather than the chat tab. And for those of you posting comments to social media, please remember to use the hashtag EUSFTA. That would be nice. If you do have comments other than questions, feel free to put these into the chat, of course. In fact, trade negotiators greatly appreciate feedback. While this is not a consultation, of course, your spontaneous input is most welcome. We're honored to have with us again a very interesting panel of speakers here today. For the welcome address, allow me now to introduce the European Union Ambassador to Singapore, Her Excellency Ivona Piorko. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannes. Do you hear me well?
Very well.
Well, I have been with you in this process since I arrived here half a year ago, I think in each and every webinar of the series. And each and every time I started by, let's say, the courtesy expression, but also generally wishing you always a good afternoon from Singapore and good morning to Europe. But it is not a good morning in Europe today. And I'm afraid we are not going to have good mornings in Europe for quite some time to come. And it's shared in Singapore among our friends here as well. I'm obviously talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine that we deplore in the strongest of terms as international community, including in the UN yesterday in unprecedented vote. To be perfectly honest, I was considering quite seriously canceling this event or not appearing here today. But we are talking today about an area which is also about life-saving in a completely different proportion and way, but still. So we decided to go ahead, but I ask you all to bear the situation we are in very much in your minds when you discuss. Still, I welcome you obviously to this seminar. As I said, trade in pharmaceuticals and medical devices that you are going to discuss today is probably one of those areas that touches all of us very closely. It's very tangible. And it is therefore so important to discuss opportunities that we have for trade in this area under the Free Trade Agreement. Well, we are we are seemingly in this world of today going from one extreme situation to another. We're now in the war situation, but this has been preceded by a world pandemics, as you know. And during this pandemics, the open trade in this area to fight infectious diseases on a global scale has been obviously put to the fore very strongly, be it in universal access to vaccines or supply of essential personal protective equipment, respiratory devices, and so on. So the strong multilateral trade action in these areas to expand the production and treatments to ensure fair access and universal access is really extremely important. I guess you all know, sometimes in surveys in ASEAN region and including here, we get very surprising responses of people who seem not to know. So once more, the EU happens to be the world's biggest donor of vaccines, mainly through COVAX facility. And our objective is to have 70% of the global population vaccinated by mid-2020. And we are also one of the main producers of vaccines worldwide, and clearly global leader also in vaccine exports. We exported 1.8 billion doses to not less than 165 countries, including very much Singapore, by the way. So that, I think, contributed to quite some extent to the figures for 2021, where EU exports of pharmaceutical products increased by 32%, but also EU export of medical instruments and appliances. And interestingly enough, the reverse direction is equally important, because the EU imports of pharmaceutical products to Singapore account now for 20% of EU imports from this country in general. So I think I've given you a bit of these figures because they are very telling, showing how important this area has become and how important, therefore, to discuss any issues that we might still have in trade, despite our EU-Singapore free trade agreement and its specific annex that we have on pharmaceutical products and medical devices. So I really welcome this opportunity once again for companies and stakeholders today to be able to exchange practice, to go into even better directions. And I really wish you good discussions because it's a very important area for all of us. And please be standing with Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And thank you for pointing out the painfully obvious, in fact. I know that several people on this call today, in this webinar, are actively involved in efforts to do what can be done. And thank you also, Ambassador, for pointing out that there is perhaps a link between the catastrophe that is unfolding and the challenges we are, at least to a humble, small extent, trying to tackle here today. Now, before we move on, let us perhaps look at the polls that we asked you to, a few questions that we asked you to look at the very beginning. The first question was asking you to guess, if you didn't know, how big is manufacturing of pharmaceutical and medical devices in Singapore itself as a share of manufacturing and by value added. And 57% got it right. It is indeed between 17 to 19%. Obviously, changes year on year. That share is higher than the percentage in volume, if you like, and it's even higher than the share in employment. So the value added is particularly significant in this area, perhaps not surprisingly. But in any case, it's a very important sector, as you just pointed out, Ambassador. Second question was, what aspects are of main interest to you here today? And here we have another clear winner, which is regulatory issues. We're also having a lot of interest in medical devices, vaccines and pharmaceuticals, of course, also very important. Regulatory cooperation is here, pricing, reimbursements, and health systems play a role. And of course, trade, I guess trade is always thought through and thought in the same context and investment itself. We'll get to that. Finally, we asked you, in your view, does the EU as FTA help when it comes to trade? We added investment and other forms of collaboration, including R&D between EU and Singapore when it comes to pharmaceuticals and medical devices. No one said it helps a lot. Maybe we can do better in the future iterations of this FTA. It helps, said 29%. It helps to some degree, 50%. So that still means that 80% say it helps, and only 21% said no or not sure. So I think that is an encouragement to go ahead and work with this FTA and perhaps improve it in the future. Now to our substantive sessions. My colleague Eugene Lim, an international trade and tax lawyer with WTA's Taxize Asia, and also the team leader of our EUD support project, will give us a brief overview of the EU-Singapore trade and investment in pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Our second session then zooms in on the main elements of the EU-US FTA relating to pharmaceuticals and medical devices, strategies and perspectives between Singapore and the EU. Eugene and I will be joining the panel of speakers along with Adriana Velázquez Virumen, responsible for health products policy and standards at the WHO, and Professor David Llewellyn, the IP expert for the Policy Support Facility project. Here, a known quantity when it comes to IPR in Singapore, of course. The third session then reflects on industry perspectives and experiences of the pharma and medical devices stakeholders and players. Our panel includes Jesus Rueda Rodriguez, the Director General of MedTech Europe's International Affairs. David Jauch, Director for Government Affairs at Fresenius Kabi and Chair of the International Affairs Committee of Medicines for Europe, the Association of Generics and Biosimilars Producers. Alex Budiman, the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Greater Asia at BD, an important medtech producer. And finally, Ada Wong, Asia Public Affairs Lead of Sanofi. Henry Tan, Vice Chair of the Medical Technology Industry Group of the Singapore Manufacturing Federation, unfortunately had to excuse himself. But to all the rest of us and you, welcome and thank you, speakers, for being here today. For our first session, over to you, Eugene, now. Lead us into the subject matter, please.
Thank you very much, Hannes, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone attending today's webinar. What I will do in the next 5 minutes or so is to provide you with an overview of the medical device and pharmaceutical industry trends globally in the ASEAN region as well as in Singapore. So if you look at the medical devices market trends, all the data that all the projections and forecasts show that this is an industry that is poised for very favorable growth. The global medical device market is projected to grow from 406 billion euros in 2021 to about 587 billion euros in 2028. Which represents a compounded annual growth rate of about 5.4%. If you look at the trends in Southeast Asia, it very much mirrors the global trends. There will be medical products in the region are likely to see growth of between 8 to 10% in most markets, led by consumables, diagnostic imaging, and lab device segments. And the factors that are driving the growth in this industry pretty much mirrors factors that drive the growth in ASEAN generally. Is firstly, the expanding middle class. Secondly, I think the penetration of medical devices into ASEAN is still relatively low, so there is still a lot of expansion for distribution of a product into this part of the world. And there is lack of domestic competition in the region. So I think these factors certainly point to opportunities for businesses in this industry looking at the Southeast Asian markets. Then turning to the pharmaceutical sector, if we looked at what were some of the supply chain challenges that were faced by the pharmaceutical sector arising from the COVID-19 pandemic, and there the major supply chain challenges really dealt with or related to the global rollout of the vaccines. And there were the challenges of having to scale up production in a very short period of time, and also to ensure that the right cold supply chain strategies were put in place in order to ensure that the product could safely arrive in the designated or the destination markets while being fit for purpose. In terms of what we see the challenges for the industry, the sector are moving forwards would really be to look at digital transformation. And like many other industries, it's incorporating technologies like artificial intelligence, big data analytics, etc., into your existing business processes and using them to develop new insights on how to improve efficiencies and market access. Secondly, refining processes and really looking at how to expand into new revenue streams in a post-pandemic age, and also looking at geographic expansion to ensure that medicines continue to be targeted for delivery to untapped and developing markets. If we look at pharmaceuticals and medical devices, the trade between the EU and Singapore, we've got some statistics here, and certainly medicaments was the top Singapore export to the EU between in 2020 and 2019. And if you look at the chart that we have here on the slide, the cover ratio for exports from Singapore, the cover ratio for exports from the EU to Singapore is 22, whereas the value of exports from Singapore to the EU was about 542. So you see that really Singapore is a huge production base for a lot of pharmaceutical products and medicaments for export back to the EU. I think if you look at these statistics, it very much supports the export values between Singapore to the EU, where the export value of medicaments in 2019 was about 2.4 billion, making that Singapore's top export to the EU. And likewise, it was also the EU's one of the EU's top 10 exports to Singapore, with an export value to Singapore of about 464 million euros. Now, in terms of Singapore, I think it's important to look at the importance of the pharmaceutical and medical devices industry to Singapore, and why there is such a strong footprint of pharmaceutical and medical device companies based here in Singapore. Firstly, a lot of the manufacturing here is for global regional supply, and that's really because of the world-class manufacturing capabilities. And Singapore has a long history of attracting the pharmaceutical industry into Singapore. So if you look at the COVID period, so between 2018 to 2021, notwithstanding the global pandemic, Singapore saw an increase in the export values of medical equipment by approximately 2.42 billion. You see that industry leaders continue to have manufacturing hubs in Singapore to manufacture a wide range of products such as APIs, drug products, and biologics. So these include, household names like Pfizer, Novartis, Sanofi, etc. There certainly is an emphasis by the Singapore government to develop the innovation ecosystem to support the pharmaceutical and medical device industries. And you see about 4 billion being designated for public sector research funding. And that has been committed to the health and biomedical science domain. And you also see that there are a lot of regulatory changes that are being dealt with by ensuring that there is good partnership between key opinion leaders, institutes, and the companies and the various stakeholders in this industry. So with that, I will hand it back to you, Hannes.
Thank you so much, Eugene, for that quite informative introduction. It's a huge area. And perhaps also to point out that just 3 weeks ago, we sat here, so to say, and discussed the trade in electronics. And there is an obvious overlap in terms of industries and trends when it comes to electronics and medical devices, but also because there's a lot of combination that is emerging with pharmaceuticals. Thank you also for pointing out the centrality of digital transformation that permeates all industries, but of course, the finer it gets, the more relevant it is, and that is certainly happening in these two industries. Singapore as a hub, I think we'll have time to discuss that. I think we have people, especially in the next session, who might be in the over next session, who would want to come back to that, including innovation and the innovation ecosystem. Now let us turn over to our next session. This session leads us into how trade in pharmaceuticals and medical devices is covered and hopefully fostered by and under the EU-Singapore FTA and the respective regimes and the international ecosystem surrounding it. Eugene will come up again and will introduce us to the EU's FTA's Annex on Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices, one of two main tools of the agreement to underpin the bilateral trade in these products. Eugene will also provide us a quick overview of pharma and medtech regulation and policy in Singapore today. He is in a way standing in for the Health Science Authority, which unfortunately could not be here today with a speaker. The same applies to myself on the EU side. I will therefore briefly look at the EU side of things, in particular 3 things: pharma and medtech regulation in Europe, the EU's still new pharmaceuticals strategy of November 2020, and a few of the most recent developments, such as the Health Technology Assessment or HTA regulation that just came on stream a month ago. Adriana Velasquez Berumen, who is responsible for health products policy and standards at the World Health Organization, will introduce us to the all-important international standardization and thus harmonization work done by the WHO and in fact other organizations. That work is prominently referenced in the EU's FTA Annex. Finally, Professor David Llewellyn, who is not only one of Singapore's top IP experts, but also the IP expert in our Policy Support Facility project that I just mentioned, will then look at intellectual property rights for pharmaceuticals and medical devices in Singapore and under the EU's FTA. Eugene, you go first.
Thanks, Hannes. So I'll provide everyone with a brief overview of the regulatory framework for pharmaceutical products and medical devices here in Singapore, and also look at the EU SFTA Annex on pharmaceuticals and medical devices, and provide some commentary on how Singapore has complied with our obligations in the Annex. So just very briefly, the main regulatory authority that oversees pharmaceutical products and medical devices is the Health Science Authority, or the HSA, Health Science Authority of Singapore. And it is charged with regulating drugs, innovative therapeutics, medical devices, and other health products to meet appropriate safety, quality, and efficacy standards. It regulates a fairly broad range of products, but the products of interest for discussion today include medical devices, therapeutical products, health supplements, cell tissue or therapy products. Now, in terms of the main pieces of legislation that deal with regulation in this area, they include the Health Products Act of 2007, and that regulates the registration, manufacture, import, supply, storage, packaging, and advertisement of all health products in Singapore. All pharmaceutical and medical device products must be registered with the HSA before they can be sold in Singapore. Complementing the Health Products Act is the Health Products Medical Devices Regulations of 2010, and that's a subsidiary legislation to the Health Products Act. And essentially, it provides further details on the regulatory regime that relates to health products and specifically medical devices, and generally only licensed medical device dealers are allowed to manufacture, import and sell medical devices in Singapore. It also provides a registration process for medical products that are based on the product's classification. And essentially there are 4 classes of medical devices in Singapore, ranging from classes A to D. I've set out in the next few slides, and I won't go through in great detail here, but essentially I replicated some of the slides on the HSA website that show the regulatory flowchart for companies that are looking to supply medical devices in Singapore. It's a very comprehensive site and a very useful first port of call for companies and businesses looking to enter the market here in Singapore. And essentially it provides for both the device registration procedures as well as the dealer licensing application procedures. And you'll need these if you are contemplating import, manufacture, wholesale of medical devices in Singapore. The next chart, similarly looks at the flow chart for companies looking to supply therapeutical products in Singapore. And there, again, it sets out the various phases from clinical trials to actually obtaining the necessary product registrations and dealer licenses, as well as the scope of control. Now, turning to the EU SFTA Annex on pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Essentially, there are several categories of commitments in the annex, and I'll discuss each of them in turn. The first relates to the elimination of non-tariff barriers to bilateral trade in pharmaceutical and medical devices. And here, I think the general sense from our research as well as from industry is that foreign pharmaceutical companies generally do not face significant non-tariff barriers for pharmaceutical products and medical devices in Singapore. Now, the regulation and licensing regime is administered by HSA, and there are very clear regulations and laws about how the regime will be administered. Now, the second obligation is in relation to ensuring that there is a competitive market that's based on openness, non-discrimination, and transparency. And here there is there are commitments about the need to publish the list of subsidized drugs, and Singapore does this on the Ministry of Health's website. And since 2017, the Agency for Care Effectiveness has been issuing guidelines for drugs called the Guide, and the Guide was most recently updated and includes addendums setting out the evaluation processes for vaccines under consideration for subsidies. So you have a lot of transparency there. The third commitment is in relation to the promotion of innovation. And here Singapore has many incentives to promote timely access to therapeutic products and medical devices. And I've set some of these out here, including the creation of the HSA's Innovation Office to enable stakeholders to request for early scientific and regulatory advice, and also provides a comprehensive list of these as well as a 50-day turnaround for screening processes of therapeutical product registrations. Now, there's also a commitment to ensure that there's cooperation between the EU and Singapore based on international standards. And there again, in the ACE drug evaluation methods that were issued in 2019, there's been guidance based on internationally accepted methodologies to assess the clinical and cost effectiveness of new technologies. And again, the criteria has been set out in the evaluation methods. And it shows also, what they mean by cost effectiveness in administration, as well as key evidence to be considered by the Drug Advisory Committee. So that harnesses a very quick general overview to the regulatory landscape here in Singapore.
Thanks a lot again, Eugene, for this. Let me then proceed to the EU side of things, and I will keep this equally brief and succinct. I will not try to do full justice to what we have before us, but by way of introduction, let me just quickly look at a few aspects that are of relevance. Now, pharma and medtech regulation relies on a network of regulatory authorities. From the 31 EEA countries, that's 28, sorry, that should have been 27 EU member states, plus Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, and it should have been 30, my apologies, plus the European Commission and the EMA. The EMA is the European Medicines Agency. The EMA and member states cooperate and share expertise in the assessment of new medicines and new safety information. They exchange information on the regulation and the various practices and good practices that are of relevance here. Good clinical practice, good manufacturing practice, good distribution practice, and good pharmacovigilance practice. Importantly, EU member states that are involved here, and there's a lot of interplay between central and decentralized processes here, they do operate under the same rules and requirements regarding the authorization and monitoring of medicines. Marketing authorization is, of course, one of the centerpieces. Here we have we have three procedures really: a centralized procedure, a decentralized procedure, and a mutual recognition procedure. In essence, the centralized procedure allows the marketing of a medicine on the basis of a single EU-wide assessment and marketing authorization. Pharma companies submit a single application to the European Medicines Agency, the Central Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use, and the corresponding committee on the veterinary side, carry out the scientific assessment and recommend then the results to the European Commission. It is the European Commission itself that grants the centralized marketing authority that is then valid in all EU member states. The centrally authorized procedure is compulsory for most innovative medicines, including medicines for rare diseases, and as a result is the avenue of choice for most innovators in most cases. The decentralized procedure is a procedure where you go to the national authorities in the EU member states in parallel, really, to look for simultaneous authorization of a medicine in more than one member state. That applies if you don't have a recognition and authorization yet in an EU country and you're not within the scope of the centralized procedure. If you do have a recognition, if you do have a marketing authorization in an EU member state, you will usually apply for the mutual recognition procedure, or you apply the mutual recognition procedure, you will apply for the authorization to be recognized in other EU countries. That allows member states to rely on each other's assessments, which is time saving and overall harmonizing in nature. Pricing and reimbursement, importantly, is happening at the member state level. That is not harmonized. The national health systems are the driving frameworks here, of course. There is, however, some harmonization when it comes to the scientific assessments underpinning this that relates to health technology assessment. I'm coming to that in a second. Member states, when they do this pricing and reimbursement administration and take decisions, they have to comply with transparency requirements. Decisions on pricing and reimbursements have to be taken within 90 days or 180 if both together are applied. The competent authorities have to follow transparent processes, and there must be a possibility for an appeal. Now, in terms of price regulation in the EU, we're looking at a very big entity. In fact, it's a compound entity in many ways, and that is manifest here when it comes to pharma regulation. We do have price controls in member states. Some have price controls only for reimbursable medicines, medicine that gets reimbursed by public payers. Some member states have it for all medicines, including non-reimbursable medicines. Others focus on prescription-only medicines. And price regulation can cover various aspects: ex-factory price, remuneration to wholesalers, pharmacists, and further distributors, etc. So it is a patchwork. And if you want to market a medicine in Europe, you have to navigate that maze, knowing that there is significant harmonization on some, in fact, some very crucial aspects. The role of the European Medicines Agency and the national competent authorities, important to realize that the European Medicines Agency is in fact feeding off the national authorities. Its committees are composed of representatives of those national authorities, but it is a central agency. It is responsible for the scientific evaluation, primarily, as I said, of innovative and high technology medicines. It prepares scientific guidance in cooperation with experts from its scientific committees and working groups. It also provides early on, optionally, scientific advice to companies in the development process. And as I just said, manages the centralized marketing authority authorization procedure. The national competent authorities, in a way, do the rest. They are responsible for the other two procedures, and they coordinate their work in a forum called the Health and Medicine Agencies, and work, of course, closely with the EMA. Most generics are, due to the nature of the beast, if you like, get their marketing authorizations from the national authorities, and that leads to a certain division in the market, but maybe we can come back to that later. We would want to move on to the next slides. The role of the European Commission, I already pointed out that the Commission itself, as the highest executive organ, if you like, of the EU as a body, plays an important direct role here. It acts on the recommendation of the EMA when it authorizes marketing of medicines EU-wide. Of course, it may also take other action. I will not go into detail here. Has the right of initiative. It drives the legislative processes and implementation processes. And importantly, and that's why we're here today, it drives the global outreach, ensures appropriate collaboration with relevant international partners, and, if you like, it promotes the EU regulatory system worldwide. Maybe we move on. The authorization and supervision of manufacturers, I will not go into too much detail here. Perhaps important to just stress the obvious that manufacturers, importers, and distributors of medicines in the EU must be licensed. This licensing happens through member state authorities. There is a database for manufacturers and for these players for pharma, and there is a corresponding one for medical devices. I'll come to that in a second. There is, of course, inspection involved in this process, and that happens no matter where you are. So if you are in Singapore or in Vietnam and you want to produce produce medicines for the EU market, you will have to get inspected by an EU authority. That's a member state authority, unless you can rely on a mutual recognition agreement. Outcomes of that inspection, however, are then available EU-wide. So once you have been inspected and you are EU GMP certified, you can export and produce for the EU market, subject, of course, to other authorizations being in place and patent and other protections being respected. Now, let me perhaps just say that if you do import products, medicinal products into the EU, you need to release the batches, and that requires testing and certification by an EU qualified person. And there's a number of processes. I just wanted to point out that even the GMP certification does not get you a free pass yet. But all of that is obvious for those of us involved in regulation, so I will not pretend to explore this here in any detail. That would be way overstating my case here today. In a nutshell, briefly, the regulation of medical devices. There is a new regulation on medical devices that has really just started to bite. It replaces an older, softer, less intense, if you like, network, in particular, the directive. It relies on a tiered system of classification. This is all medical devices. It also relies on a wide definition of medical devices. The tiered system of classification really has 3 classes, or 4 if you like, 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. 3 being the most sensitive, 1 being the least sensitive in terms of regulatory intensity needed. The classification rules that apply to bring a device into this system rely on a number of factors: duration of contact, degree of invasiveness, anatomy affected, active, non-active. It's quite complex, obviously. I will not pretend to be able to summarize this here. Importantly for trade, most medical devices require third-party conformity assessments, and that involves the so-called notified bodies in the EU. There are various routes. Sometimes the manufacturer actually has a choice between systems-based certification or assessment and products assessment. You can combine, if you have a more intensive one on the one side, you might be able to do a less intensive one. For example, check only documentation on the product side when you have a quality management system in place, etc. Importantly, clinical evaluations are usually required to establish safety and performance, and the people involved in this exercise, and that is again very relevant for trade, of course, include manufacturers, authorized representatives in the EU. You have to have one for any medical device that is being marketed in the EU. And you have importers and distributors who have defined responsibilities. All of that, not surprising, but that is centrally regulated. These responsibilities are centrally regulated in that EU-wide regulation. The authorities issue certificates of free sale. That's when if something can be marketed in the EU, you can get that certificate, and that often gives you a free pass or a semi-free pass in other markets. That is very convenient. I already mentioned the database, and I think we will come back to combination products in the following sessions. So let me move on quickly. I will actually jump over the in vitro diagnostic medical devices regulation. Now that is another medical device regulation that actually will start to bite and become applicable in May of this year. I said that I would briefly talk about the HTA regulation. Health technology assessment is an important tool in the toolbox. It's not new, but the use of it has been streamlined in the EU just now. There is a multidisciplinary process involved that eventually looks at the value of a device or a pharmaceutical product from, if you like, a societal perspective. and is very important for pricing and reimbursement decisions. The new HTA regulation, as I said, has just come on stream. Importantly, the member states in the EU retain the authority to draw the conclusions from what is partly a centralized procedure to generate what is called a joint clinical assessment. So all rely on the same data, but they may come to different conclusions what those data mean in their national systems. Let us move on. I will jump over this in the interest of time and just perhaps say one word on the pharmaceutical strategy for Europe. That's a document that came on stream in November 2020. That means way into the pandemic and also reflecting the needs that emerged from the pandemic. That strategy tries to take, and I think successfully does take, a holistic view of the conundrum of industry, different types of products, and of course, public health and individual health. It touches on issues such as affordability of medicines, but also the need to streamline the IP system involved. Some of the elements that I've just discussed are, in a way, of course, intertwined with that strategy. The strategy didn't change fundamentally what was going on, it just added to it, including in particular the focus on making sure that supplies are in place. That is, of course, the concern that many of us have been focusing on. Let me stop here with this presentation and move on immediately to our next speaker. Adriana, you are the you're responsible for health products, policy and standards at the World Health Organization. You're actually, in fact, not sitting far away from me here today. I am very interested to hear your views in this context. Over to you, Adriana.
Thank you very much. Hannes, thank you very much for the invitation. And I would like to say that the Singaporean concept has been expressed and the European. So let me go to the global aspects of health products, and I will, of course, emphasize on the medical devices one. So may I have, okay. So first of all, we have the Sustainable Development Goals. As you all know, these were 17 goals that were set in 2017, and the number 3 is on good health and well-being. Next. So and one of the aspects of the SDG 3 is to have universal health coverage. And for that, of course, it will be including financial risk protection, access to quality essential health services. And as you can see in around the box that says which population is covered, how much cost, which interventions, we need the healthcare workers, the guidelines, the medical equipment, the information, the medicines, and the infrastructure. If we don't have everything at the same time together, the clinical intervention cannot be done. And those clinical interventions could be for prevention, for protection, for maintenance, for monitoring or treatment of patients. Next, please. And well, this is just a roadmap that we have for medical devices. And the goal is really to ensure improved access to safe, quality medical devices, but they should also be affordable and available and acceptable. So we have the first line on the industry that should be based on needs. The second one is exactly on health technology assessment, as Hannes was stating. And those are the lists for medical devices for reimbursement or procurement. In the case of medicine, it will be the same. And the regulation process for medical devices, it is the same as for medicines, not the same, but it's a process to approve the marketing of that health product in a country. Of course, the medical devices are based on risk, which the medicines are not. But we have a whole new aspect on the medical devices that is really after the procurement has been done. It's the installation, the training, the maintenance, the safe use, and of course, then we have the post-market surveillance that is the same as many other health products, and the decommissioning and replacement. So the medical devices are far more complex. As you can see here, we have a wide range of types of medical devices, and they're much more complex than the medicines. So we are lagging behind, but that doesn't mean they're not important. They, of course, are very important, are needed for prevention, diagnostic, treatment, monitoring, etc. And sometimes they're self-use, but sometimes they require a doctor, nurse, a technician to use them safely. And of course, we have medical software embedded here. Next, please. Next slide. Okay. And then, as we were saying, we have these big boxes. So the health technology regulation, we need to measure safety, performance, and quality. Then on the HTA side, we need to see clinical effectiveness, the ethics, the cost, the social issues, the organizational issues. And then the third column is the health technology management on the procurement, selection, training, supply, use, and of course, trade comes also on that aspect of HTM. In WHO, we have cataloged these by colors. So HTA is something like a purplish color. The health technology management is the blue section that goes from the needs assessment, procurement, donations, installation, and so. And then we have the list of what is coming out from HTA. That is the list of priority or essential medical devices. And I'll talk more about it. Next, please. All these guidelines are available in WHO. So here you can see the wide variety of guidelines that we have in WHO as a global guidance. And needless to say that all these documents had a periodic update, but due to COVID and due to emergencies, we had to accelerate some of these, the production of some of these documents, like the priority medical devices for COVID-19 and associated technical specifications, or for personal protective equipment that were just developed in 2020 in a super fast time and with consultants. We are also talking about innovative technologies. So in reality, we have to have a whole aspect of global guidance for the world. Next, please. Next. Okay, talking about regulatory systems. We need to be able to harmonize, work for reliance, and regional sharing of information. That is really what we need. Next slide, please. Then we have the WHA 6720. These are resolutions that are approved by all member states. So in this resolution, if you want to find it, but it actually urges member states to engage in global, regional, and sub-regional networks for regulatory authorities, to do international cooperation, harmonization, etc. And then it requests also WHO to work on areas that are lagging behind, like medical devices. So this is very important because this is now becoming a priority, and actually COVID shows us that it has to be a priority. Next, please. Then, of course, you have all the work that has been done on access to medicines, the harmonization, and then even the resolution that is coming on pricing and transparency of prices that started for medicines, but now it's going also all the way to all health products, including medical devices. Next slide, please. The work on regulatory for medical devices, we published document 2017, and now it's being updated as we speak, considering all the regulatory models and networks. So we recognize INDRF, we recognize the HWP, we recognize African medical devices, and then we pull them all together to have a global guidance. So this document is being updated now, will be released by the end of the year. It talks about legal framework, pre-market, post-market, also issues about the nomenclature, software as medical devices, and innovation. And of course, it has a section also on artificial intelligence. Next, please. On health technology assessment. Next, please. Okay, there's another resolution that's the 6723. I made a mistake, it's not 69. So the idea is to strengthen, urges member states to strengthen the link between HTA, health technology regulations, and health technology management. So the three things need to be aligned. And the idea is not to duplicate any efforts, studies, clinical trials, cost effectiveness, that every aspect should be providing input to the next one. And to develop methodology access. Next, please. So it requested the Director General of WHO to assess the status of health technology assessment, to raise awareness, and to provide support to member states, and to build the exchange of information and capacity building, as you can see in the last section. Everything that is highlighted in blue, that looks into harmonization. Thank you. Next. Okay, this is a super important slide because this tells us if with the continuous spectrum of health technology assessments. So we have fragile states, as we have post-war, post-COVID, post-Ebola, that we need to define what are the basic packages of all the health products for essential interventions. As we start going up and then going to the strong health systems, then we have to have the integrated care, universal health coverage, also health products that are needed for emergencies. And then we need to go through that HTA process to define what is absolutely essential, what could be priority, and then what are the real needs in the country. So the idea is to use WHO guidelines, WHO list for the essential medicines list, the essential health products list to define, and also the package of benefits and the list of interventions. And WHO is doing the compendium of UHC interventions and also for emergencies so that they can be used widely for member states. Next slide, please. Then, because we were requested as WHO to do this assessment, we went through trying to see, is HTA being used in countries, yes or not? What is the capacity? What are the governance? And if an HTA gives a recommendation, is the government taking that decision or not? So this is exactly what the study talks about. The book is available in the WHO website. Next, please. And here, basically what we were saying is the national agency, unit, or committee that produces the HTA report given to the Ministry of Health, and is the Ministry of Health taking the decision or not? And we found that that was not always the case. So we're now working towards improving that the recommendations from HTA can be taken by Ministries of Health. Next, please. So we did the study for surgical interventions, vaccines, medical devices, medicines, and service delivery, and all these studies, and then by income, country level income, and they're all available for you to look at. But these are very interesting findings. Of course, this was done 2017. The next slide, please. And then what we did is we found that there are also a lot of legislative requirements that were not available by then. Next slide, please. Then we just did that, concluded that exercise and the survey for all countries, and it is now published in a new website that is called Health Technology Assessment, new page in WHO, just released like 2 weeks ago. You can go there, look into the information, and look also into the country profiles. Next, please. And now I'll just go very quickly through the 4 lists that WHO has. This is the essential and priority list. Next, please. They are all done through consultations, through expert committees. And as you know, the essential medicines list has been there for many, many, many years. Next, please. This is the list of priority medical devices, which is now also being developed and available. Next, please. The issue about nomenclature of medical devices, that is a big issue because it is very diverse. Next, please. There is a wide variety of nomenclatures globally, and we need to harmonize it, and WHO is looking for member states for support on that issue. Next, please. I just want to go. This is the information system that is called Medical Devices Information System, available to all. Next, please. There are priority assisted products that is also listed in WHO. Next, please. The essential devices, in vitro devices list. Next, please. They're all in the electronic platform for consultant for everybody, and we're updating it. Next, please. I think this is almost like the slide. So the idea is that all these guidelines are used by countries to ensure a better healthcare for all. Next, I think that's the last one. Yeah, so it's basically WHO has all these guidelines available for all of you, and we look forward to working with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for you squared the circle, you did the impossible, you covered just an enormous amount of ground, but I think you gave us a great feeling for just how big this field of harmonization and cooperation is. It's an enormous challenge, and my personal admiration really goes to health authorities that manage to do this, and of course to those harmonizers like yourself who are trying to bring all of this together. One of the many areas of harmonization the layman doesn't necessarily have in view is nomenclature. It's just one of many you mentioned. But I think that just shows how much groundwork has been done and will still have to be done. David, intellectual property is your lifeblood, almost as much as it is the lifeblood of the pharmaceutical industry. And of course, to a lesser extent, the medical devices industry. It's not all about patents, though, although it is partly, but also producers of generics and biosimilars have IP interests, albeit not quite the same as the so-called originators. David, I'm looking forward to your take. Over to you. As you did notice, we are running a little bit behind time, but that's just general encouragement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannes. Fortunately, I don't have as much detailed material as Hannes had to go through, and also the previous speaker. Because it's really quite easy for me here, I think, because I've been given the topic of IP protection for pharmaceuticals and medical devices in Singapore, and a lot of this will be familiar to businesses in the European Union. Next slide, please. Because if you look at the type of patent system that we have here in Singapore, it will be very familiar because it is largely based on the 1977 United Kingdom Act, which in turn has its origins in the European Patent Convention in 1973. And so you will not be surprised if you come to Singapore about the patent system. That shouldn't be a great surprise to you generally either about intellectual property, because obviously Singapore is a member of TRIPS. It's also a member of international agreements, and it is proud to say that within the region, it has a state-of-the-art intellectual property rights system, and arguably as important, a court system that is efficient and very effective. And in fact, this week, it's been announced that there will be a new court to deal with intellectual property matters of a lower level, where there will be a maximum damages award of $500,000. And more importantly for many businesses, the fees will be kept to a maximum of $50,000. It's modeled more or less on the Intellectual Property Exploitation Court in London. And this is an important move forward in terms of access to justice of many businesses in the intellectual property field. But the intellectual property rights, as you all know, are to a certain extent, the parameters are set out in international conventions. So the differences are really in the detail, and some of that detail has been dealt with by the free trade agreement, by the EU free trade agreement, and also earlier by the US free trade agreement. But you will recognize what you see here. So just an example there on the screen of a patent in Singapore. The next slide, please. And it will be no surprise that in Singapore, as in the countries of the European Patent Convention, you can get a patent for an invention, product or process, easy, duration usually up to 20 years, although there is the possibility of patent term extension, but only for a patent which includes a substance which is an active ingredient of a pharmaceutical product. And we may come back to that later. Again, as with all patents, we're still waiting, of course, for the what used to be described as the Community Patent Convention to come into force. But a Singapore patent is a territorial right, only enforceable in Singapore. Just a word before I move on to the other areas of intellectual property, trade secrets. Obviously in Singapore, we don't have the EU Trade Secrets Directive, and the protection for trade secrets is under the common law, common law or equitable cause of action for breach of confidence. There is no specific trade secret statute. And that sometimes comes as a bit of a surprise to businesses from civil law countries. Next slide, please. Sorry, this is the standard stuff about patents, so I don't need to spend any time on it. Next slide, please. Trademarks. Hannes mentioned that it's not all about patents, and it's not all about patents because for many businesses, trademarks are extremely important. And on the slide here, I've just pulled out a few registered trademarks in Singapore here, which belong to multinational corporations with which you will be familiar. So again, trademarks, an area where there are no real surprises because the Trademarks Act in Singapore is based on the 1994 Trademarks Act in the UK, which in turn was based on the 1988 EU Approximation Directive, or the first Approximation Directive. And so no real surprises. Again, territorial right, duration 10 years. There is in Singapore, as there is in common law countries, protection for unregistered marks under the tort of passing off, if you've used a particular mark, even though it's not registered. So trademarks, no surprises. And indeed, with trademarks, often in Singapore decisions, there will be reference to decisions of the European Court of Justice, decisions of the General Court, decisions of the EU IPO Boards of Appeal. Although obviously they're not binding on Singapore courts, often the parties and the court will refer to comparable or relevant decisions in the EU as a matter of course. You also got registered designs, and here I've picked out some registered designs from the Singapore Register. Glaxo's, what I would describe as their Ventolin inhaler, then an AbbVie injection device, and the particular get-up of a Novartis tablet. Registered designs, next slide, please. Again, protects the external appearance of the article. It must be new, however. It's also territorial right, and potentially you can get protection for up to 15 years. Next slide, please. Copyright. Here we've recently had a modern copyright law in Singapore come into force in November last year. A act to modernize some of the terminology to make it more user-friendly. It's a user-friendly act that is 541 sections long, I should, however, point out. But again, no need to register copyright in Singapore. And indeed, there's no possibility of registering copyright in Singapore, unlike in some other Asian countries like Thailand or like China even. So protection of expression, of ideas in tangible form, no need for registration. 70 years plus the life of the author for literary works, and literary works obviously would include clinical and research papers, databases, but the protection for databases is only the selection and arrangement. Singapore does not have a database right like the EU database right. but works such as product inserts would be protected as copyright works in Singapore. Next slide, please. That's it. I told you I would do it very quickly and get us back on time. Really, the important thing to emphasize is that Singapore has a state-of-the-art intellectual property rights system. The difference is that one might be surprised about have been ironed out largely as a result of the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement and also as a result of the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on that. And we might come back a bit later to some of the issues on patent term extension with regard to active ingredients, which have caused a bit of controversy. But I think, Hannes, I probably got you back on track.
Thank you, David. You did what you could. We're not quite back on track yet, but I think we will be getting there. Let me not stop for a Q&A now in the interest of time. We will have time at the end to come back to questions. So thank you to the 4 speakers, or 3 plus myself, in this second session. Before we proceed to our next discussion, I would like to remind everyone to submit your questions to our speakers via the Zoom Q&A toolbar. That is below here. Now to our third part of this webinar, in some ways bringing us to the real juice, if I can say so, namely the perspective of those whose businesses are supposed to be supported by this free trade agreement, the medtech and pharma industries of Singapore and the EU. We'll do it a tiny bit differently for this session. We'll do shorter first statements perhaps, and then enter into a discussion within the panel and with you in the audience. And let's also reverse for once the poetic order. Usually we say pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Let us start with medical devices and then go to pharma. As we move forward, feel free to already comment on or complement each other's statements, dear panelists, if you like to do so. Jesus, you are the Director General responsible for international affairs at MedTech Europe. I assume it's fair to say that the EU's FTAs are your daily bread. As we move forward, let me perhaps quickly, since you are coming from the medical device perspective, you and Alex, let me point to a question that is in the chat by Julia Lingen, who is the director of JVL Asia. And she asks whether injectable products for aesthetic medicine that are largely classified as medical devices should not be addressed in different ways in the regulatory systems that we are dealing with. I'll let you read that question as you come to it, but if I just wanted to point it out if you want to refer to it already now, if later, that's equally fine. So Jesus, thanks for sharing your perspectives here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hannes. Just some introductory remarks. I mean, you've all been hearing about what we've been doing in the EU with our new regulatory framework. And if you were to look at what's happening today, you would find that for medical devices, you're going to have some products that are already under the new medical device regulation. You will find that you have products that are under the old directives going through the grace period. And then you have both the IVD regulation and the IVD directive that are also applicable. Even though we haven't started the grace period with that yet, you still have products that are under both regimes. So we've got 5 different regulations and directives right now that are the basis for placing products on the market. That makes things very complex. And as you mentioned, Hannes, from my perspective, I spend a lot of time looking at this FTAs and trade agreements. And one of the things that's very interesting is that trade agreements and FTAs in particular, they have formal mechanisms through which we work, but they also create a much better understanding of each other's systems, which leads to a better dialogue and a better way of doing business overall, even if it doesn't actually formally go through the FTA process. And something that we've seen with the countries that the EU has these free trade agreements with, it tends to facilitate issues, especially in the regulatory sphere. I'm not going to go into everything that the regulations, the new EU regulations are trying to do, but I will point out one thing that's quite important that they don't do. Everyone talks about what they do, but it's equally important to understand what they don't do. And essentially, the regulations will not change a product that's safe and effective and fulfills its function. So for all of the additional requirements, all of the changes, all of the new information, all of the new things around it, if you have a product that works under the directives, you will not change your product. It'll be the exact same product under the regulation. And we're finding that the vast majority of products fall under this category. I mean, most of the products work and so don't need to be changed. You will see changes around the information of the product, so on the labels, on the instructions for use, this sort of thing. But the actual product itself and how it works, how it's functioned, how it's used, by and large, is not changing. And that is very valuable in the context of FTAs, because since it's the same product, it gives you a degree of continuity that you can play with. And I know that my colleague Alex is going to look into some of these issues in more detail, how it's played out in Singapore. Regarding the question on aesthetic devices, there is an underlying issue here. And the underlying issue is the fact that aesthetic devices, especially implantable aesthetic devices, which are the ones that are considered medical devices right now, they are assumed to have very similar risks to other implantables with a medical purpose. That's the rationale for why they have been included into the medical devices regulation in the EU. To be fair, the process for reaching the market is slightly different from that of a normal medical device, because things like an assessment of a risk-benefit ratio, you cannot do it in the same way for an aesthetic device as for a medical device with a medical purpose. But it is something that's there. That's the rationale. There's also a political imperative. And the political imperative that remains, and it's still very much present, at least from a political perspective in Europe, was the impact of the substantial PIP scandals that we had. Well, it was now many years ago, but it still carries a lot of weight in the EU. And therefore, there is a strong feeling, both with policymakers and the public, that these products need to be controlled, and they need to be controlled just as strictly as medical devices. So that's why they're there. I'm not saying it's the best of solutions, but it's the solution we have right now, and it's very unlikely to change at this stage. So with those introductory remarks, let's move on.
Thank you very much, Jesus. There's a lot of juice that we will already have. I can see it in your face that there is more to come if you get poked. Alex, you are the VP for Regulatory Affairs for Greater Asia at BD. BD, of course, is a very big player in medtech. You are based in Singapore, but your responsibility is regional. In fact, you are here today to hold up the flag of APAC Med. So I am hoping for both Singaporean foreign company and a regional perspective, all wrapped into one. When we spoke, you said, among other things, a very straightforward sentence that stuck with me. You said, the ask from industry will always be convergence. Very powerful. Against those backdrops, give us your spiel.
Thank you very much, Heinz. I hope I'm audible okay?
Very good.
Good. All right, so I have just a couple of slides, a brief intro, if I may, on BD as a medtech company. It's a 125-year-old company headquartered in the US with a significant presence in Singapore and Asia. In Singapore, particularly, we have been operating a manufacturing facility quite sizable for the last 30 plus years. And we have 9 manufacturing plants spread throughout Asia. On this slide, you can see in terms of the breadth and the size of the company. It's gone through a few acquisitions, as you can imagine. So it serves interventional, medical, and life sciences segment. So as you mentioned, I'm here on behalf of APACMet. So I serve as a vice chair of the Regulatory Affairs Committee. And as a committee, this is our sort of our vision statement and our objectives for the next few years. So our aspiration is to be the voice of the industry, partnering with regulators throughout Asia Pacific. Our industry members are all medical device companies, in Asia Pacific, with sort of the counterpart of MedTech Europe, if you will, or APACMet in the US, or a Eurochamp, which some of the audience you might be more familiar with. And in terms of our strategic pillars, I'd like to direct your attention to the second one in the middle, as you mentioned, is promote regulatory convergence. There's another term for this, which you'll see later in my slide, which is reliance, and that's been mentioned previously by another speaker. So I'd like to just maybe go into a current state and what we have seen some level of convergence in the space specifically between Singapore and the EU. So one is a significant one, which is CE mark. So CE mark is the symbol of European approval that has been well covered with regards to the transformation from the directive to the regulations. That's certainly a major undertaking. So as a regulatory agency, the HSA recognizes the CE mark so much so that for a Class B, it grants an immediate approval. And for Class C and D, which are the higher class products, there is this expedited review, which saves time, is slightly less on the submission, and improves speed to market. So that's been in place, and it's been working quite well, I would say. The second point I'd like to make is that HSA is a leading regulatory agency in the region. The previous speaker with regards to the IP framework and law in Singapore is quite advanced. I would say that's the same as far as being a regulatory agency. It is an IMDRF member, despite the relative small market size. And it is also been recognized by at least one regulatory authority here in Asia as a reference regulator. So there's been this very successful project with Thai FDA to do this regulatory reliance, where for certain class of devices, if HSA has already conducted an assessment, that assessment will then be applicable to the Thai FDA. So there's no need to repeat the particular review or assessment. And there are discussions with other regulatory agencies as ongoing as well, which is very encouraging to us in the industry. Another point I'd like to make with regards to current state on the convergence is this EU MDR, IVDR, although there won't be any change to the products, as Jesus mentioned, there's extensive change with regards to labeling, in some cases indications, and there could be other changes that are sort of piggyback on all these changes. And these changes, unfortunately, will typically require submissions, change registration submissions to regulatory agencies. So HSA is one of the leading regulatory agencies, has published guidelines to simplify the process so that it will not be sort of a bottleneck, because all of the medtech manufacturers who operate or sell products in the region will have to submit all these change registrations. And the timing is rather tight, especially for IVDR, which has gone live or is going live soon in a few months in May of 22. So that's, from our standpoint, it's been best in class with regards to this change notification guidelines. APACMet took a lot of the points from HSA's change notification guidelines and published position paper, and the expectation is that other regulatory agencies in the region will follow suit as well. So these are three sort of examples on the current state, just to kind of give you the baseline. What we feel that there are opportunities that can be embarked on, especially with the EU MDR, IBDR CE mark, and I think Jesus alluded to earlier that the bar is raised, right? So there's this PIP scandal that might have started this whole movement towards stricter regulations, more oversight. There's no question that the bar is raised. FDA used to be seen as probably, sort of the flag bearer, but now, CE mark is almost, up there. So we believe that there's now an opportunity for HSA to look at opening and broadening the immediate approval route to possibly include Class C and D devices if it has a MDR or IBDR CE mark. That's one. Another opportunity would be, and this is something that we saw during the pandemic, where member states in the EU initiated derogation to be able to create access immediately for emergency use. There's also an emergency use provision in HSA, but certainly with having an approval in a member state in the EU, if this can be mutually recognized in Singapore, that will make the accessibility even faster, especially under certain conditions that may require such. The third one would be regulatory reliance expansion to EU. So mentioned that between Singapore and other regulatory agencies in the region, there are discussions to build on what has been successful between the HSA and Thai FDA. Perhaps the EU can consider HSA as a reference regulator. Right? The notified bodies are frankly quite swamped with a lot of the assessments that have to be repeated, if you will, under the new regulations. So that's perhaps an opportunity. And something that was mentioned previously in the space of the health technology assessment, further harmonization is another opportunity. I have an illustration just to show you, this is the current state, if you will, or the current evaluation route. Hence, previously you talked about the different class and a different process. Maybe I just show you the proposed on the next slide is where we believe now there's an opportunity to look at Class C and D devices with CE mark that's been reviewed under the EU MDR, IBDR, perhaps could also enjoy an immediate route in Singapore, given the assessment and the scrutiny that's been put under in Europe. So I'll turn it over to you, Hens.
Thanks so much, Alex. I heard quite a few important things here. Your appreciation for the work that the HSA is doing, and I believe Ada will refer to that again, is important. Most interesting for me as a trade lawyer is this drift towards regulatory convergence that you have exposed in its various iterations here. It ties in quite nicely, I think, with what Jesus said at the very beginning. FTAs seem to be giving us, I would say, soft law in the sense that they foster a mutual understanding, and as such may have an impact that is not perhaps written into the letter of the agreement, but rather happens in real life. And I think things like these change guidelines and the simplified procedures that you pointed out, the interplay between new regulatory steps coming on board in trading partners, the use of the CE mark here, all of these are encouraging signs that this is happening, and it's happening with a focus on facilitating things. So thank you very much for this, David. Ada, over to you. You are the Asia Public Affairs lead at Sanofi. Sanofi, of course, is a very big multinational player with French roots. You are based in Singapore like others, I believe, because your company is highly invested here and uses Singapore as a hub. I hope you will give us a glimpse of the reality of bilateral EU-Singapore investment and cross-investment in the pharma sector. Needless to say, of course, that you're most welcome to pick up on any theme, any other theme as well, not least against the backdrop of what we just heard from David. Ada, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hans. I think my task is the most easiest one amongst all the speakers here. My job is just answer why Singapore. I think as for Sanofi, similar to many pharmaceutical companies, we use Singapore as a regional hub, and Sanofi recently made the announcement to set up a high technology vaccine factory here in Singapore. Currently, we only have 2 similar facilities in the world. One is in France, our headquarters. The other one in Singapore. I do believe that it's an unspoken way to outline the strategic reasons why we pick Singapore as a location, as Asia for Asia. I think that's many factors to let us to make that decision. First of all, geographic location, the advancement of the regulatory system. Many speakers have talked about it earlier. To well-developed infrastructure and the whole ecosystem that the healthcare sector can access to, the local regional talent through the local and regional partners. And in fact, this decision, we would like to set up a factory is well before COVID-19 happened. I think that the unexpectedness, the scale of COVID-19 pandemic just demonstrate the importance of the prevention strategy, the importance of the vaccines beyond pediatric in this region. Hope I answered your question to state that why we choose Singapore as a regional hub and a new factory location. Back to you, Hans.
Thank you so much, Ada. Okay. Thank you so much, Ada. I can't get my video to work. Thank you so much, Ada. And I made a mistake when looking at my notes. I jumped over David Jauch, Director of Government Affairs at Fresenius Kabi. And he is, importantly, the chair of the International Affairs Committee at Medicines for Europe. David, you are here today for the pharmaceuticals, for the generics industry and the generics and biosimilars, to be more precise. Thank you so much for being here. I know that you have differentiated views on FTAs, including the Singapore FTAs, and we're very keen to hear your perspective on that and on any other aspects you want to pick up on today. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannes, and thank you for the organizers, including you and the different chambers of Singapore and Europe and delegations to organize that workshop. I think it's an important one. And if we quickly go through the slides, sure, yeah. So I don't think I need to give an overview again. I think this was done already sufficiently. So if we move on to the next one. And just to give a little overview and maybe say a few words from where we are coming from. So I would say there's clearly 2 parts of the pharmaceutical industry. One that is off patent and one that is on patent. And I think that with that in respect, there's not one is good and one is bad, but it's just some complementary parts. One part of the industry has a different business model than the other. One obviously looking for the monopoly during the patent protection, and the other one is in a very competitive market with many other players. So we have followed under this context many FTAs, and we have seen there a certain unbalance. What we also saw with respect to that agreement, here you basically see the time frame of I think a rather quick negotiation, at least in some parts of the negotiation between EU and Singapore. But of course, ratification in Europe always takes a bit longer, especially as there were some controversial topics. So even Singapore not being a very large country, it led to many, let's say, inner European discussions on the competencies of the European Commission versus member states, especially regarding the ambition of regulatory aspects. So many of the previous speakers talked about the regulatory processes and whether this is part or not of the right of the Commission to actually negotiate that for the member states. If we move on to the next slides, there's, let's say, the chapters that are important to us and obviously also to others. SPC as a supplementary protection certificate, the implementation of that, and 5-year data exclusivity. This is in particular something that I want to highlight later, that I don't necessarily find as a positive aspect. If we move on to the next slide, keeping also the time in mind. Another important thing, I think, for companies that are more in the off-patent sector, the procurement but also I think for the ones on patent sector, the pricing reimbursement is very important, and how this is done and what has to be fulfilled in order to participate in the mostly public hospital market. So here there's importance to reflect on that further and to discuss that further. Not sure if we will get to that today, but if we move on to the next slide. Very good. Then there's some, let's say, more economic factors to reflect, as well as IP ones, also from a company perspective. So Medicines for Europe, representing mostly generic, biosimilar, and value-added medicines companies in Europe, but obviously that have a global scope. So I'm coming from Fresenius Kabi, which is based in Germany, but we also follow very strongly a philosophy of where we produce within a region. So we produce a lot in Europe for Europe, we produce also a lot in Asia for Asia, and we have many production sites, but they are more in Vietnam or in Indonesia and in China. We do not have a manufacturing site in Singapore, which also has a reason. I may come to it. And another aspect, if you're looking into, let's say, more cost-effective medicines and products as well, that obviously are not under a monopoly situation. Singapore is a relatively small market. And you also need to consider that if you produce for the region or for global scale, there is some minimum orders that justify the allocation of the product to the market. So this is something we also need to really reflect from an economic point of view. That many companies that may not be able to have then, let's say, Singapore as their first market. Which is not the case for us and Fresenius Kabi, but we have spoken with different members and then saw that this being an issue. And then one really big obstacle, and I saw it also in a Q&A, somebody raised that question to the other David, so to say. I think it's very important to reflect that in Singapore you have naturally also for the patent term extension, but now through the agreement with Europe and the US, even let's say not, I wouldn't say hostile, but not of patent friendly system that makes it relatively difficult and relatively expensive to bring generic or biosimilar medicines on the market. And that's also due to the non-existence of, let's say, in the US, very famously known Orange Book. We move on to the next slide. Basically, it's in case you don't know, of course, the IP experts do all know, but it's you know, a place that is defined by authorities to claim which patents are relevant for your off-patent application, and when you bring to the market that you have to prove that these patents have either expired or have been invalidated. So that as this doesn't exist in Singapore, companies really have to figure out by themselves which patents are relevant and which one aren't, which is a relatively difficult process. And in particular, process patents may be a stumbling stone here. So this may be something, and I know that there's some IP legislation discussion ongoing in Singapore. This may be something changing or being considered in that reflection, but certainly something that is making it difficult for off-patent medicines to enter the market. Move on. So we have done with IGBA, which is the International Generic and Biosimilar Association, a study to reflect a little bit more on free trade agreements with the perspective of generic and biosimilar companies. And obviously, Singapore was already being discussed there, but we decided not to include it in that study because it just, came into force, and there's not so many data that can be used. However, there's several other countries that have that can help us as a base case to reflect on what is happening. Generally speaking, in the last couple of decades, there's mostly a negotiation of larger, economically stronger, or what we have observed is that large, economically stronger areas or countries negotiating with smaller ones, and obviously leading to a transfer. It's obviously not a negotiation amongst equals. So therefore, there's mostly a transfer of higher IP standards from the stronger nations to, let's say, the smaller markets. That's the same for the EU-Singapore agreement. That's the same for EU-Korea or US-Korea, naming a country within the same distant region, let's say. But also when you look at other EU or US agreements that are not amongst EU and US themselves, as this hasn't come to fruition. But if you look at two others, there's clearly a track record of extending patent terms. And don't get me wrong, I'm totally a supporter of patents and IP, but I think it's important to have the right balance between patent protection and competition in the market. So an extension of patents into a very long period is also reflected in hurting healthcare budgets and undermining patient care. So I think this is important to strike the right balance here. And if we move on to the next slide, and here you can just look at it later. Eventually, what are the FTAs we have had a closer look at and observed under specific molecules that we reflected. So if you move on to the next slide, you can see here on the example of Korea, where you had a very specific case that you have the EU-Korea and the US-Korea agreements. And we selected molecules. And we selected molecules before the FDA. There are molecules that are in, let's say, the same class. So they are somewhat comparable. And then you select basically on the left-hand side, you see the value and the volume of those molecules in the markets. And with the yellow line, you see the loss of exclusivity. So when all the patent term extensions, SPCs, etc., that at that point of time didn't exist yet, expire. And then the penetration of the generic market. So meaning that you see how quickly is the uptake of the non-originator products in the market. What you then can see on the left-hand side, on both the volume and the value basis, you see a relatively larger uptake. Now, after the FDA implementation, and therefore, as I think somebody called it earlier, soft law, or also the hard law changes that come with that, makes it significantly more difficult, and it would take much longer that these molecules that are in the same class, treating the same patient population, reach them. It means also a higher cost for the system. So if you move on to the next slide, you see it also with respect to Mexico. Again, two sartans that are in the same class. And here you can see that even to a larger extent, what was the impact on the volume and as well as on the value basis. And we also had a reflection on the US. So if you go to the next slide, there we were, theoretically thinking about what is the impact of TRIPS that was implemented, obviously. And here, what we've done as well, and this is exactly the same for Mexico and Korea, obviously to a different number. What is the lost cost saving of the healthcare system? Meaning, what do taxpayers need to pay more in order to sustain the extended monopoly? And we came that it equals the wage of 1,000 nurses. It also does reduce the health of patients. And by the way, in Korea and in Mexico, you have very similar numbers. Obviously, the lost cost savings is smaller compared to the US. But in terms of wages and payment to doctors and nurses, it amounts to very similar numbers. And you really also need to reflect on what it means for patients' health. And therefore, if we just to wrap it up with that slide, and hopefully there will be the chance to discuss the topic during the discussion. We also had a reflection on the CETA. So there was the EU-Canada agreement, again, a larger market like Europe with a smaller market like Canada. There was, again, the implementation of the SPC, and this has a tremendous cost, obviously, for the Canadian system. But what I want to also highlight that there was the reflection on the generic industry as well, as there's so-called certificate that allows for production during that. So in Canada, they don't call it SPC, they call it Certificate of Supplementary Protection. That allows for production of the products for export to third countries. So this may be also something to reflect on striking the right balance. It's not only about giving something to originator companies to extend their patent, but also to enable access to patients, to enable more medicines in the market, or to enable the manufacturers within your country to produce to third markets where naturally the exclusivity may expire earlier, as we have obviously very different patent terms and protection terms in the different jurisdictions, which often leads then to a move of company production sites to different jurisdictions. So that's why I think it's a very important thing to reflect. And with that, I like to wrap it up, also reflecting on the brevity of the time, and hope we can have a discussion on that later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Very rich and some food for thought here on the balance. It's all about balance, isn't it? Let me follow up directly with you, David. There is a question in the Q&A that is directed to you, and I have suspicion perhaps also to the other David. Is the current patent linkage regime in Singapore helping early entry of generics compared to other patent linkage systems existing in other countries? If not, what would be the required amendments? Hosts, perhaps we can already bring up David Llewellyn as well, if he's able to respond to this. But David Jauch, let me play over to you.
Yeah, maybe let me give it
a view on this.
First shot, and then I would hand it over to the other David. I think, so generally speaking, patent linkage is always bad. It's always detrimental to competition and to access to medicines. So the European Commission has actually abolished patent linkage and ruled it illegal. So it is unfortunate, of course, that patent linkage still exists in many countries. So generally speaking, patent linkage is obstructive and is not helping. Because why is that? Because as a generic company or as a biosimilar company, you need to develop, obviously, the product not after the patent expiry, but way before, many years before. And then if, and that happens also quite often, the originator is, let's say, using its full legal power. In Europe, for example, an issue called divisionals, to have unclarity of whether a patent hold or if it will actually be enforceable. This would obviously delay much further the process of regulatory preparation and delay further the access to medicines for patients.
Thanks for that, David. David Llewellyn, David.
I suppose,
please feel free to comment, and also if you would like to add a quick word, we don't have too much time, a quick word, perhaps if you like, to what David said with respect to other aspects that might tie in quite nicely here.
I think I would just come back to this, the word that you introduced, and indeed David mentioned, which is balance. Because I think with a lot of these things, if one picks one thing out of context, then often it can seem to not necessarily be a good thing. And I think that's one of the problems in this area, because if you, as David described, obviously, if you start off with a supplementary protection certificate in the EU, obviously compensates for the duration of the R&D and testing processes as well. Whereas in Singapore, obviously, the patent term extension is much more limited. And so on the one hand, the generics get something there because the extension is less. And yet, on the other hand, because of the patent linkage, which I think is unfortunate. I mean, I think aspects of it are clearly unfair and in some respects silly. So the 45 days that a patent owner has to decide whether or not to sue the generic applicant for a product license for infringement, and 45 days is nothing if you've got a complicated decision to make. And I'm not sure that 45 days is right, but then equally, the 30 months moratorium that follows from all that is clearly a bad idea as well, because why 30 months? It's not clear to me, where did that 30-month moratorium come from? Why should it be 30 months? I think in Korea it's 9 months, in Taiwan it's 12 months. And I mean, there have been some interesting cases here, which we don't have time to go into in this area, but I mean, it seems to me that some of the answers that are put forward, such as, oh, the generics company could apply for a declaration of non-infringement. Well, that suggests that even in Singapore, where the system is quite efficient of getting court judgments, it still requires quite a lot of time and quite a lot of money in order to do that. And it really depends on where the balance is. And I think the difficulty always is looking at this patchwork quilt of FTAs and picking a bit out here and a bit out there. It depends on what the balance is. And I think David's comment about Singapore being a small market is an important one to bear in mind as well. Because the suggestions, for example, that there be an orange book in Singapore, well, okay, but why should that be needed in what is a relatively small market? I would argue the generic producers know more or less what are going to be the patents that may be involved when they come to Singapore, because they've seen it in the US or other much larger markets already. And so I think one just needs sometimes to step back and say, yes, of course, we're all in favor of getting patients pharmaceuticals at a lower price, but equally, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And as David said at the beginning, he's in favor of the patent system. And the question then is, well, a patent system which gives effective protection for how long? And that's a debate that's been going on since 1624 and the Statute of Monopolies in England. How long is an effective period of patent protection? So I think you pull one string and then something else can come undone, and it's extremely complicated.
I would be in favor of trying to pull a few strings to get the ball rolling for sure, because Singapore is an extremely negative case of a system that is not really that is clearly imbalanced to one side versus the other, and like I said, it's a rare case, and it's unfortunate. And I think also Korea is also a rare case, as I tried to point out with the previous one. And that's, I mean, it's a result of also geopolitics. If you negotiate with a larger country, you have to obviously give a bit more than you receive in the end. And that's unfortunate. That's why I think it's important, especially for the negotiators of the large countries that have both industries, off patent and on patent, to reflect that in their negotiations, as they are in a stronger position to make this decision.
And I totally agree with that, David. But having represented in the past companies which have, on the one hand, a generics arm and on the other hand, a proprietary arm, I know this schizophrenia even exists within companies. So the schizophrenia needs to be reflected by the trade negotiators as well.
Schizophrenia and balance. What a nice dichotomy here. Gentlemen, let me, as they say in the news, that I'm afraid that's all we have time for now, but let me put in a small caveat and just bring one question back to Alex and Jesus. A few weeks ago, as I said initially, we talked here about electronics, and one of the experiences there, which is very close to MedTech in many ways, one of the experiences there was that the integration of value chains was such that there was a lot of going back and forth in this industry. So collaboration went both ways. So that surprisingly, for example, tariffs in Europe played a role for European companies that needed Singaporean suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. Is that integration also part of your story in the MedTech industry? And does the FTA help in that? I think, Jesus, you kind of pointed to that, but I'd like to just play it back to the two of you as the MedTech people here in this round.
I do think that overall, and Alex, jump in and contradict me whenever I make a mistake. The FTA does help to have a better integration of the very complex supply chains that we deal with in the medtech sector. So in that context, I think that that's actually beneficial because the FTA covers much more than just medtech. And it's therefore all of these components, all these pieces that we can put together to make for a better supply chain process overall. And we're seeing this also with other countries with which we have FTAs. It's much easier to establish these supply chains and make them more robust and resilient, which incidentally is one of the things that right now in the EU and in other jurisdictions, we're pursuing much more diligently to make sure that our supply chains are robust because we've had so much disruption over the course of the last couple of years. So that's something that's really on everyone's minds.
Yeah, if I can,
Alex?
sure, I can second that, what Jesus just said, right? It's not directly under my domain, but what I've heard is that we do enjoy sort of the open border with regards to being able to bring in certain components or even medical devices if they are not for distribution in Singapore. So we could do staging, we could do storing. You know, that is something that we do enjoy in Singapore, which is it's a main logistic hubs, if you will, in the region.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, obviously a lot more food for thought here than we have time for today. Ada, I want to come back to you quickly for a last word, if you like, before we wrap up.
No, I agree what Alice mentions about, I think the Singapore market is very small, but the openness, open board, I think it's very, very important decision that makes so many pharmaceutical companies, healthcare sector to set up regional headquarters here. I think my only fear is that how other countries, especially across ASEAN, can take it as a reference point to make it better, not just from harmonization's perspective, for investments perspective, for listing perspective, that so much things we can all work together, make this region even better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ada. Thank you so much, everyone, for these important contributions here. We did scratch the surface. We scratched below the surface. I think we touched on some celebratory points and some points where more work can be done internationally, globally, perhaps also in the bilateral relationship and locally, if you like, in the EU and Singapore. At the same time, we also heard that the performance of the regulators, especially the one in Singapore, of course, I think Ada, you pointed me to that recognition that the HSA just received a few days ago. Is stellar. The complexity in Europe is much greater. The agencies, the setup is more complex. Jesus vividly reminded us of the 5 regulatory instruments that are currently applying simultaneously to MDRs and so MDs and LVDs. All of that spans literally the globe because it all relates to the most important public health imperatives we have all been made so painfully aware of in the past 2 years, if we weren't aware of them before. A lot of work to be done. We didn't get to many other things that we could have talked about, such as initiatives at the World Trade Organization, etc. It just means we have to meet again. Don't know where, don't know when, but I must thank you very much for being here today. Mrs. Justina Lassig, the head of the EU delegation's economic and trade section, was going to conclude this meeting. She has been called away urgently, so that leaves it with me. This concludes our webinar, and we would really like to thank you all for joining us today. We're very grateful to all of our speakers for their participation, to our audience, not least the industry. We hope that the discussions here were useful for you, and your business. We also extend our appreciation to Eurocharm Singapore for their support in making this webinar happen. Once again, if you would like to view or share this webinar, a recording will be available on the YouTube channel EU in Singapore, and the presentations will be uploaded to the EU delegation's website at www.europe.sg. The EU delegation will also send an email to all the participants with the links to these materials. Thank you and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you. Goodbye.
All right.